This is an eagle feather that was a gift from my mother this summer. Me and her have a hard time telling each other how much we love each other. So I have this gift here as a reminder that she really does love me, and I hope she knows how much I love her too. As an out-of-territory Cree woman, it is both an honor and a privilege to be speaking on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit and the Métis Nation of Ontario. Minagisagao, Tansanina Wapiskwa Squale, Aga Mahagina Squale. It is a beautiful day, and I'm delighted to share it with all of you. My Cree names are both Whitebear Woman and Wolf Woman, and my English name is Megan. For many of you, this may be your first time hearing the Cree language, but it is my utmost hope that it will not be your last. With that in mind, I want to teach everyone here today another important Cree phrase, and it's Acimowin. Now, Acimowin means to tell a story. Besides increasing our Cree vocabulary, I want to share a story with everyone here today. Before I do so, it's important for me to not only comment on the power of storytelling in general, but I will also tell you about my relationship with storytelling as a Cree woman. In all instances, the impact of storytelling is unquantifiable. The ripple effects pose the potential to easily exceed any one of our lifespans. While storytelling is a universal practice, it is always grounded in a culturally specific context. It's important that I emphasize the unique structure of Cree stories. For those of us who are unfamiliar with this style, they may seem strange and difficult to understand because they don't typically follow a linear path, rather they are cyclical. As well, Cree storytellers choose to share stories as a way of relating to one another, rather than acting as if they are superior or no more. From my understanding as a Cree storyteller, stories serve as multi-purpose tools. They are told for educational purposes, disciplinary measures, or spiritual and ceremonial practices. Today, I share a story to recognize a history that has been subordinated by the mainstream Canadian assumptions of what is valid, true, or important. I share a story to honor a life. I share a story in solidarity, and I share a story as a means of resistance. The impact of storytelling through oral transmission within the Cree Nation has been and continues to prove to be a formidable force against all acts of violence by the Canadian state. It's my cookum and my brother. I want to share a story about a woman who's very important to me and holds an important place in my heart. Her name is Helen Osbourne, and she was born and raised in my First Nations community before she was murdered in a non-Aboriginal community while attending residential school. If I tell this story in the right way, then battles become massacres. And if I tell this story in the right way, then we all become characters who have a responsibility to acknowledge the crimes that are daily committed on the bodies of Aboriginal women. And if I tell this story in the right way, then it begins many years before she was even born. As I mentioned earlier, Helen Betty was from my home community, which is traditionally known as Kinosao Sipi, or Fish River, and this falls under the larger Cree Nation. According to my Muslim, who fed, clothed, and sheltered his family as a hunter, fisher, and a trapper, the Swampy Cree were very important actors within the fur trade. As a matter of fact, Norway House was the original site of an important Hudson Bay Company trading post, through which one could access both the Hayes River and the Nelson River, which would eventually lead you to the Hudson Bay. Traditionally, not only were the men skilled hunters, fishers, and trappers, but the women were also capable of taking on this responsibility if necessary. Aboriginal women not only held the exclusive ability to bear life, but they housed vast amount of knowledge, and they were respected and entrusted with the responsibility to distribute communal resources. At the height of the fur trade, a plethora of Western European men immigrated to this land in an attempt to make their fortune. It soon became apparent that most newcomers were unable to cope with this land's vast and varied landscape that was often unforgiving to strangers. It was by the grace of Aboriginal women that most, if not all, of these men survived. So this reminds me of the time my Muslim gave a toast at my mom's wedding. Typically, he's a very serious man. So when he stood up to speak, I was very surprised to hear him say in Cree that he loved my Kukum with his whole heart, and he knew that she was a strong woman who he could depend on as a partner. And my Kukum, in her typical embarrassed Cree woman way, she's like, "Gigi spun," which means, "You're crazy." She was so angry at him. So if we fast forward from the fur trade to the mid-20th century, we can see a dramatic transformation in the perceived value of Aboriginal women. Suddenly, Aboriginal women were slandered and discarded by the very community of settlers they had once saved and protected. The impact of ongoing colonization and its genocidal impulses proved to have a terrible effect on all Aboriginal nations within the new Canadian boundaries. Most First Nation communities were coerced into signing modern treaties with private companies to exchange their natural resources for finite sums of money that would run out a lot sooner than those resources would. Norway House was not exempted from this terrible trend. They say that Helen Betty wanted to become a teacher in order to help her community. However, I would argue that this decision was undeniably informed by coercion, because during her lifetime, our community was undergoing a radical transformation in traditional lifestyles with the transition from subsistence economies to settler economies. Not only were livelihoods destroyed, but intricate systems of education, knowledge, social arrangements, and spirituality were fractured. Even if Helen Betty wanted to be a traditional Cree bushwoman, that simply was not a feasible option for her. The once revered position that Cree women occupied was being viciously denigrated by colonization. In 1969, Helen Betty moved to the Paw, Manitoba, a non-Aboriginal community 5 hours west of Norway House, in order to go to school. This community has been and continues to be marred by intense racism and sexism towards Aboriginal populations. The pervasive view of Aboriginal women in this community is that they are good for only one thing: fucking. Yet in spite of this, Helen Betty persevered and had completed 3 years of her Western-based education. On November 13th, 1971, Helen Betty Osbourne was 19 years old when she was abducted, tortured, and murdered by 4 non-Aboriginal assailants in the Paw, Manitoba. The impact of this crime continues to exert violent tremors still felt within my community. As she was walking home after visiting friends around 2 a.m., she was forced into a vehicle by 4 men who had intended to rape her. And as she was forced into the vehicle, she struggled for her life while they physically and sexually assaulted her. She was driven to 2 different remote locations that night. At the first stop, she was dragged from the vehicle, stripped naked, and viciously beaten on the snow-covered ground. Fearing they would be discovered, they forced her back into the vehicle and drove her even further from safety. It was at this final location that Helen Betty was murdered. And as a later autopsy report would state, she was stabbed over 50 times with a screwdriver and had suffered incalculable blunt force traumas, which were likely blows from fists and boots. The impact of racism and sexism proved to be a difficult obstacle to overcome for Aboriginal women, as it would take over 10 years to convict at least one man of this crime, when I would argue that it took a whole community to murder her. Kamaskoa Wisi Squel, which means strong woman. Recently, a peer asked me why I share this story. And to be honest, this is a question I struggle with on a daily basis. I share this story because in 2003, Helen Betty's niece became yet another missing sister whose severed body parts were found floating in Winnipeg's Red River. I share this story because it is estimated that 700 Aboriginal women in Canada have gone missing or have been murdered, and it seems like nobody gives a shit. I tell this story because When my mom studied in the PA, and I was one of the few Native kids in class, I had no friends, and the explanation as to why was so succinctly explained to me by another 6-year-old peer who said she couldn't visit me because I was a dirty Indian. I share this story because no 15-year-old needs to witness 4 police officers break into her home without just cause to watch her mother be assaulted and treated like she isn't a human being. I share this story right now because my heart is breaking for my sister, who is currently being charged with assault by her abusive boyfriend, who also happens to be a cop, because she finally gained the courage to defend herself. I share this story because I just can't shake the words of Thomas King, who once said, "If we stop telling the stories and we stop reading the books, we would soon discover that neglect is as powerful an agent as war and fire." And finally, I share this story because I believe that one of the most important means of defenses that Aboriginal peoples have engaged in has been storytelling. Even when the Canadian state tried to make us feel ashamed and worthless in order to assimilate us or get rid of us, we kept telling our stories. And in spite of the damning hushes, we kept telling our stories. Maybe it's because we like the sounds of our own voices, or maybe it's infinite patience, but even when mainstream Canada refused to listen, we kept telling our stories. Even when it was illegal, we kept telling our stories. And even when threatened with violence and death, we'll keep telling our stories. So I just want to finish by saying a few words to Helen Betty. And I hope she knows that I'm saying it with love and all the love I have in my heart. Naspik kisagitin gagige minagagige. Ginen askamitin.